It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Erik Stam, Dean and Professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. We've been having speakers from the US the last few days. Dr. Stam is our first speaker from Europe. So welcome, Dr. Stam. He has his PhD from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. His research interests are in the area of entrepreneurial ecosystems, as you already know, because all of you have read papers for today, economic development, economic policy, and firm growth. He's published in leading journals in this area, research policy, which is one of the papers you read for today, small business economics, entrepreneurship theory and practice. He has more than 100 books, book chapters, and articles in a variety of disciplines, including economics, geography, business management, and public administration. He's a co-editor at Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, one of the leading journals in entrepreneurship. He frequently engages with government, startups, and corporates on innovation and entrepreneurship, and has worked with many ministries in the Netherlands and in other countries, the European Commission, OECD, G20, United Nations, and the World Bank. And he's on the advisory board of several public and private sector entrepreneurship organizations. With that, welcome, Erik.
Thank you. That's a long introduction.
Erik, let me start with the first question here. How did you get interested in entrepreneurship research?
Yeah, perhaps the question is not why I'm interested in entrepreneurship, but why I got interested in research, because I come from a family of entrepreneurs. So I have a lot of family businesses, self-employed, and what we now would call scale-ups in my family. So I was the first one to enter academia. So that was sort of more special than studying entrepreneurship. So that is the reason I sort of stayed in entrepreneurship, but moved to academia, and especially that had a sort of a longer history. So during my studies, I was not really interested. I was more interested in my cycling career. So I had a career as a road cyclist with teams in Europe. But at some moment, the team broke up, and I only had 1 year of studies to go. And then I had a lecture from my professor. I think most of you are inspired by one or two professors, and this was my inspiring professor who taught about Schumpeter, creative destruction, economic development. And this fascinated me because, well, I knew about entrepreneurs, but not let's say the theory behind this and how entrepreneurship can lead to resistance in society. So creative destruction is not only about creation, but also destruction. And I wanted to know more about it. So I wrote my master thesis, and I got sort of to like doing research. So I thought, well, why not take this seriously and write a PhD? And well, ever since, I think I've become more interested in studying, researching entrepreneurship, but I've always had a toe into the world of practice, either business practice or policy practice, so to say. And I would also say, perhaps in addition to that, entrepreneurship research also gives you the opportunity to really act at the interface of research, business, and government, and also to combine a lot of different disciplines: economics, geography, business administration, sociology, even philosophy, computer science, medical science, engineering. And that's what I do. So I call myself sort of an undisciplined economist, and I think doing entrepreneurship research is sort of, par excellence, the job to do that.
Erik, later in this conversation, we'll come back to how you manage the time to do all of this. But at this point, let me ask you, if you're joining academia and not the family business was disappointing to your family, or if they give you a hard time about it?
That's a good question. So my father, at my PhD defense, said to one of my best friends, well, now Erik is forever lost for the business world. So he was a bit sad about that.
Yeah, same happened to me when I left the family business and came into academia. My dad said, you're now, not going to be working in the real world anymore. So now you've done a lot of research on entrepreneurial ecosystems. Can you share with us what you see as problems and opportunities in the ecosystems literature?
Yeah, so let me tell you a bit about how I came involved in this. So I have been involved in doing research on entrepreneurship and economic development, regional clusters for a long time. But I think this research did not really reach the policy audience, also because I think it was a bit too much ivory tower, too much inward-looking discussions. And I think about, well, what would it be? About 5 to 10 years ago, or probably 10 years ago, there was this emergence of this thing called entrepreneurial ecosystems. And the nice thing about entrepreneurial ecosystems is that it is recognized in the world of business, venture capitalist, policy. And initially I thought, well, this is a new fashion or a fad that policymakers need. So every 5 or 10 years, they need a new label. Before it was the clusters, creative class, etc. But even though being critical, it also enables you to have a language to talk to different stakeholders. And I think that was really the promise and gain of the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach, that it was really enabling a bridge between science and practice, even though there was a lot of, let's say, bursts and metaphors, which are not always that useful. It really also developed a language that enabled academics to reach out to entrepreneurs, to venture capitalists, to policymakers, to have a sort of a joint quest of how can we improve the context for entrepreneurship. So I think that is the good thing. And I think you've read the article with Bernd Wirth and Ben Spiegel, which is soon to be published in ETP. And we also think that the good thing about the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach, that it brings together different disciplines, academic disciplines, but also practice and academia. I think that's the good thing. The bad thing is, you can perhaps also read in this paper that there's a lot of academic work that sort of opportunistically, and also I would say policy work that opportunistically uses the ecosystem wording and framing. Well, it's just old stuff on the clusters or completely other things. So it's also a bit, that's the downside, so to say. So it's if it's everything, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And I think for the future, let's make use of the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach as an integrating device of bringing a lot of disciplinary knowledge together on getting to better learn and understand how context enable and constrain entrepreneurship. And also, that's also what I say to my students, but also to policymakers. It's now much different than 20 or 30 years ago. We now live in the age of big data. So there's much more data available from LinkedIn, from venture capital, etc., to really get a good diagnostics of how your region is doing or how your city is doing. It's not rocket science, so we won't get perfect data, but I think there's a big promise of making better use of data. And as scientists, we should also give proper interpretations of what this means. And I would really see social scientists working much more together with computer scientists and also with network analysts, complexity scholars, to better understand economies as complex systems that enable and constrain entrepreneurship. And that is one direction. Another direction is that we have been a bit, if I may say so, naive about economic growth, just measuring this as productivity and income growth, which is important, don't get me wrong. But economy, of course, is much more. It's also about health, well-being, environment. And I think the next step will also be to not have warm feelings about these dimensions of prosperity, but also to better measure them, and also to show how entrepreneurship can or cannot contribute to that, and how we can develop ecosystems that enable these kinds of entrepreneurship to achieve those societal challenges and these different dimensions of prosperity. And I think there's a lot of progress there, but there's still a big challenge to really achieve that. Just like GDP was a social science invention of the 1920s, we now need to work on alternatives in the 2020s, so to say.
Cool. And so Erik, now sort of switching gears here a little bit, when you review papers and when you edit papers, what do you look for in a paper? How do you decide if a paper has potential or not?
Yeah, so that's a bit of a judgmental decision, of course. So there's no sort of algorithm to go through. But I think that it's the combination of novelty and value. So just arguing that you have a novel database or a novel question or something, that in itself is a necessary requirement, but not sufficient. It should also be valuable. And then, of course, you can make a distinction valuable to particular academic audiences that have been accumulating knowledge in a particular domain, so that you're also building or standing upon the shoulders of giants before you. Or value in the sense that it puts light on societal issues from a new point of view. So that is also enlightening for example, understanding the phenomenon of crowdfunding, or understanding how culture constrains particular types of innovation and entrepreneurship. So it's both novelty and value, and this value can be more in the academic realm or more in the societal realm, but it should, if it's just novelty, yeah, then I'm not so likely to push this further and to send it to reviewers, but it should also be valuable, and it should also have the potential, or preferably been written in a way that it shows this value, so to say. So that is, and of course, there are sort of more basic, that it should also be rigorous. You should be confirm academic standards, but I think that is sort of superfluous to mention here.
Okay. Now, before we open the floor to questions from the participants, I have one more question for you, and that is, can you tell us about one ecosystems project that you're working on these days? How did you get the idea? How did you put together the research team? Where are you in the process?
Yeah, so the big promise of the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach is to really tackle the long-term dynamics of regional, local, national economies. But the difficult thing is that before you can make a movie, you first need to make a picture. So we've put quite some work in making good pictures of regions, of ecosystems. But in order to make a movie, you need to have long-term data. So that's much more difficult to have longitudinal data than to have snapshots. So we are now working on a paper that is really much more longitudinal than the prior papers, analyzing the evolution of entrepreneurial ecosystems in 40 Dutch city regions over a period of almost 20 years. And then we are really able to find out how stable or dynamic the conditions of these ecosystems are, how they lead to particular levels of entrepreneurship, and how this entrepreneurship then feeds back into the ecosystem. And I think that is really something I would have liked to do immediately, but you first need to build up a conceptualization, snapshots, etc. You need to make a lot of steps before you can make this movie, so to say. And now we are really making movies. So that is really what keeps me, well, one of the most promising projects I'm currently working on.
Erik, in a project like this, which is so long-term, how do you put together the research team?
Yeah, this is almost a community, more a community than a team. So this idea has been at the back of my mind for 10 or 15 years already, and I started to do, let's say, proper entrepreneurial ecosystem research in 2014, I think. That means that I was then already looking for data, and we were lucky enough to find data back to 2008 that was at least covering the dimensions that we deem to be relevant for entrepreneurial ecosystems, and then follow this over long term, and also building up relationships with people that provided data, because, for example, entrepreneurship data and high growth firm data is not something you can easily find. So sometimes you have to build up relationships either with people from the Census Bureau or from particular private data providers. You also need to get in conversation with people from neighboring disciplines, in my respect, from complexity science, to understand how you measure particular things over time. Then you need to find funding for research assistants. In my case, I was lucky enough to get funding from the Dutch Medical Science Council, because they want to understand how regional economies are prepared for the next shock like COVID. That's a bit of an unusual opportunity, so to say. But you really have to be building a research program, so to say, and that includes building networks, relationships, but also being on the lookout for funding. So in that sense, it's a rather complex endeavor, I'm afraid to say. On the other hand, this also means that you sometimes need to build up a program slowly. So that is perhaps a bit of a sobering news to PhD students. On the other hand, I remember, so one of my important mentors, Andy van der Ven, who just passed away last week, he said you really need to invest 10 years to become an expert in a particular domain. So yeah, I can only echo this. And also for me, it means means not just investing in academic relations, but also with other stakeholders, policy, data, funding, etc.
And Erik, as you can imagine, I have many questions for you, but we'll come to those later. Let's open the floor to questions from the audience. Akriti, can you turn on your video and ask your question?
Hi, Professor. My bandwidth is a bit low. That's why I was not turning on my video. So my question is about industrial sector. The industrial district is comprising of various industrial sector specific firms and other elements into it. But under one cluster, there are several ecosystem elements. So if one element changes, that may impact the other elements to change. For example, the regulatory mechanism over there in a particular industrial sector. So what I was asking about the micro level to which we may get to understand this kind of situation.
I can somewhat have somewhat difficulties in.
See, for example,
in hearing you. So if I understand,
is it audible now? I'll turn off my video camera so that
slightly better.
My bandwidth. Yeah. So what I was saying is, so one industrial sector, specific firms and other elements are there in one industrial district, as we were discussing with Professor Gupta. So, but under one, and if one element, for example, I'm from agricultural entrepreneurship, I'm working in that area. So in agricultural entrepreneurship, there are n number of semi-sectors or sub-sectors, you can say. So if we are talking about robotics and drones, so in that case, the regulatory environment plays a big role. So when the one element of the ecosystem gets changed, it impacts other elements as well. So how micro we should go in understanding the ecosystem?
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of multi-level research. So understanding both the macro and the micro. On the one hand, we have a lot of data on the macro level, and I'm perhaps guilty of making use of too much macro level data. And on the other hand, we also like to do both interviews and also have micro level data to understand how changes in the system affect the behavior at the ground, and how behavior at the ground can be aggregated towards the system level. So I think indeed changing the regulations is a nice sort of experiment to see how agents are affected by that, and also how other parts of the ecosystem, for example, particular types of finance or particular knowledge or skills, become differently important due to this regulatory change. And especially, I think the example that you mentioned, so in agriculture, in drone technology, and perhaps food and consumption regulation. Well, these are very interdependent in nature, which also learns us that a complex systems view of the economy is very useful, because that explicitly focuses on these interdependencies.
Thank you, Erik. We'll go now to Jun.
Thank you.
Yunho.
Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Stam, for your great recent papers. So, and I also appreciate wonderful updates to your models. I have a quick question about regarding your entrepreneurial ecosystem, and that's in your research policy paper. Mm-hmm. So, and I think this might be related to your recent research about 40 Dutch cities. So, in the research policy paper, as far as I followed, you rated all elements equal and deal with some extreme values. However, my thought is, given some prior studies like Professor Ben Spiegel or Harrison's SEJ paper or something like that about the process theory of entrepreneurial ecosystem, isn't it possible some ecosystem factors lead the other factors, some higher values of some factors might lead the other elements. So in some cases, ecosystems with the few higher indices would perform better than ecosystems with the average factors, and the quality of the other factors might be improved or something like that. So I just thought
Yeah, yeah. There are at least. Thank you, for asking this question. I think this is part and parcel of the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach, and we didn't touch upon that in the research policy paper because the research policy paper was about making good pictures, and we would like to move to making movies, so to say. And indeed, then the empirical question becomes: well, what kind of elements are more fundamental in, let's say, initial catching up, and which ones are more following later on, so to say. And we are now doing what we call a Bayesian analysis to see whether particular factors are more likely to affect other factors over time than other factors. So which ones are more fundamental to start with, so to say, and which ones are more likely to follow upon each other. This is still very much work in progress, so I can't tell you the exact outcomes. And by the way, this would be the outcomes for regions in the Netherlands, which is a quite peculiar context as well. The other way to deal with this is the so-called configurational approach, so that you find out the different configurations in particular segments of the economy or at particular levels of development, which might lead from jumping from the 50% percentile quality entrepreneurial ecosystem to the 75% percentile, so to say. And then we found out that moving up to the highest quality entrepreneurial ecosystem, then you need to have everything in place. But if you move from the 50% to the 70 or 75%, then it's especially finance, formal institutions, and physical infrastructure which are most fundamental. So then you can see that some elements are more important than others to make the catching up from the middle part to the, let's say, more developed part. Even though I should say the analysis that we've done for that are cross-sectional, so you should be careful not to put too much causality and process thinking into that. And that would indeed be also, I think, a good next step for follow-on research to show how regions go through these configurations over a 10 to 20 year period in all kind of different parts of the world.
Manash, you want to go next?
Thank you, Professor. I'm also working in this area of entrepreneurial ecosystems and my PhD thesis in understanding multi-level entrepreneurial ecosystems and how they motivate the entrepreneurs, more specifically female entrepreneurs. And when I study the literature, one thing that comes up regularly is the argument of lack of theory in entrepreneurial ecosystems. But to say the specific theory, kind of, we are talking about theories mostly taken from different other disciplines, institutional theory or any other theory. So I want to ask you as a nascent or upcoming researcher, how should I think about developing or kind of looking towards contributing towards theory development in entrepreneurial ecosystem? As a new researcher, what should my approach be towards understanding or developing a new theory in entrepreneurial ecosystem, or try to do that?
Yeah. Yeah, perhaps I'm a bit different than than most scholars in this field. So I think there's an overemphasis on theory and theory development. There's so much theory around, and we are talking theory as academics so much. So I think it is much more useful to integrate those theories into frameworks that are useful for understanding reality, and perhaps even more important, for improving reality. And of course, that might mean that for particular types of entrepreneurship, so female entrepreneurship or migrant entrepreneurship, you need to think about different theories or combining different theories than when you look at, let's say, the creation of unicorns or something like that. So it's horses for courses, so to say. So you should be aware of what you talk about and what kind of theories are useful for that. But I think overall there's no lack of theories, but there's an abundance of theories, and it's especially a challenge to combine them properly for particular questions and to pose the right question, and also to pose questions that are relevant to the world outside. I might be a bit different than the usual academic scholar, but I think you only probably have one life to spend, and you better spend it in a way that both improves science, but also the world outside. And then theory development is more something that follows than that leads, so to say.
Wonderful. Jorge, you go next.
thank you very much for this great insights. Actually, you touch upon a little bit to the question that I would like to ask you. In the paper, for example, the Brush and colleagues talk about women's entrepreneurship in this context of entrepreneurial ecosystem, but I see that they use it as a kind of perspective. I'm thinking if you see any possibility to talk about focused view of or developing entrepreneurial ecosystems around some specific groups or actors, like refugee entrepreneurship ecosystem, different entrepreneurship ecosystem, or maybe women entrepreneurship ecosystem.
Yeah. No, that is something we are currently doing. I haven't published about it, but there are some good papers about it. And I think the key question here is how inclusive is the ecosystem that it also accommodates and enables particular types of entrepreneurship. And for example, for migrant entrepreneurship, the issues of language might be very important. For female entrepreneurs, there might be a lot of gendered constraints with, for example, the lack of finance or the lack of role models. So I think the entrepreneurial ecosystem framework in itself is quite generic, but you have to make it tailor-made for particular types of entrepreneurship. And that is a bit of a combination of just getting to know these potential entrepreneurs and to find out what the constraints are that they face most severely. That's from the bottom up, so to say. And on the other hand, also learn from neighboring fields. So for example, if you study migrant entrepreneurship, there's a lot of work in anthropology and sociology about migrant entrepreneurship. And please make use of that to enrich your framework as a business scholar.
Thank you very much.
Neeraj, you want to ask next?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity. I was just wanted to look into the intersection of innovation and entrepreneurship. Actually, I'm working in the current work. So in there, I found actually two different terms like innovation system and entrepreneurial ecosystem. So means a lot of similarities I can found in terms of different factors like knowledge transfer, networking. Means in both kind of ecosystem it is there. Do you see any kind of similarity or differences between them? And also, do you see any kind of convergence happening in the literature to means in terms of the innovation literature and entrepreneurship literature? So that is
So they share a lot. So they share an interest and a focus on new combinations, like the Schumpeterian idea of innovation. They also share a systemic view on reality and on the economy. Where they differ is that innovation ecosystems really focus on innovation and technological innovation as an output of the system, while the entrepreneurial ecosystem literature looks very much at how individuals create new value in a much broader sense, not necessarily technological innovation. And as you might have read the Measure Twice, Cut Once paper, we also did an empirical test to see whether the innovation system index also predicted the level of entrepreneurship, or better or worse than the entrepreneurial ecosystem index. And there you could find that it also predicted the levels of entrepreneurship quite good, but not as good as the entrepreneurial ecosystem index. So I would say horses for courses. There's some overlap, but if you want to understand entrepreneurial outputs, you better use the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach. If you're really interested in technological innovation, you better use the innovation system approach. And let me put it a bit more stringent here. If you would like to understand how innovative incumbents are and their spin-offs in a particular region, for example, in India or Bangladesh or in the Netherlands, then I think the innovation systems approach is very useful. If you want to understand how individuals team up and set up new ventures and grow them, I think the entrepreneurial ecosystem is much more important. And for example, one key difference, if you have a very stringent intellectual property regime, that might be good for these incumbents to innovate, but not good for startups to innovate.
Thanks for the great insight. Thanks.
Christina, you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Professor. So Professor Stam, thank you for your time. Professor Gupta was talking about the issue of trying to mimic the Silicon Valley ecosystem, and how does that fail? In your opinion, can an entrepreneurial ecosystem be built not through policies and financial incentives, but through increased support by resource providers or connectors? So, for example, I'm in contact with an angel network here in the UK, and the head of the angel network has told me that they were trying to kind of build an ecosystem from scratch by providing resources, not financial resources, but mentorship to firms that are at very early stage or at the idea stage. And then from what I understand, this initiative kind of failed. They were unable to, to produce any actual impact. But I was wondering whether this would be a space that would be interesting to study. So trying to build an ecosystem through mentorship.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think talking about entrepreneurial ecosystems, you should talk about developing them, because they are everywhere, and it's a question how good or bad they are. So building ecosystems from scratch, well, perhaps in a desert or on reclaimed land like we have in the Netherlands, that might be okay, but in most other cases it's about developing something that is already there and making it better. So I would exchange the wording of building for developing. That's one. The second is that if you look at the elements that are important for enabling entrepreneurship in a particular place, so the ecosystem elements, it is very often a combination of public and private sector involvement. If you think about physical infrastructure, it is almost never fully the public sector nor fully the private sector. If you think about knowledge and talent, in some countries, the private sector might be very good in developing talents. In other countries, it might be the private sector which is much better in developing talent. So I think it's an empirical question to what extent the public or the private sector should leading this or should have a major role. But I think in practice, it's very often a combination of public and private sectors, and it depends on how well the public sector is developed or how well the private sector is developed. Let me give an example. In Nigeria, there's quite a lot of entrepreneurship, but the public sector largely fails. So then the private sector needs to step in, and it becomes relatively more important. If you look at Sweden, the public sector is very well developed. It is a high quality, and then of course it couldn't do without the private sector, but it can take a much more leading role in developing the digital infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, the formal institutions, etc.
Thank you, Erik. Philip, you want to go next?
Thank you for the opportunity. My question regarding, especially when I was looking at your paper, today we read it, other than the entrepreneur as a person, like an example, talent, knowledge, leadership, culture, all other components of entrepreneurship ecosystem is somehow related with the economic ecosystem. In that case, how do we differentiate a unique ecosystem for entrepreneurship rather than jumping into or we are going to land up in economic ecosystem?
Yeah, I think each and every ecosystem is unique in its relative strengths and weaknesses, but you need to discover this with a framework, for example, the framework that we have developed. So in that sense, I agree with you that you need to find out the uniqueness of each and every ecosystem. On the other hand, to find out about this, you need to have an instrument that allows you to find out, just like every, let's say, micro animal is different. You need a microscope to find out what is different about each micro animal, so to say. So yeah, on the one hand, you need to have a framework that allows you to look at the world and to understand the world, which is somewhat generic. On the other hand, it needs to be so sensitive that you can find out about the uniqueness of each and every region.
Great, thank you. Audra, you want to ask next?
Hi, yes, thanks. I was reading through this and I just wanted to tell you what a tremendous project this is. And I'm marveling at how much work must have gone into this. And so I wanted to ask more from inspiration perspective of, like, can you speak to how you persevered through this daunting project? I mean, from wrapping your arms around this very messy concept to operationalizing all the different measures, finding the best measures, not to mention, I'm sure, all the hurdles that we don't see in the final product. Anything that you could kind of give us junior scholars when we're facing probably even less daunting tasks than this?
Yeah, so you only see the successes, and there's a multiplicity of failures behind this. So what I always say to my more junior colleagues is that rejection and failure is the rule, not acceptance and success. So that's perhaps a bit of a sobering message. On the other hand, yeah, I think, well, there are no simple recipes to success, but please reach out to others, build teams, ask more senior scholars for advice, for inspiration. So, for example, to mention a few scholars so Andy van der Ven in the organization theory field, David Aldrich in the economics field, Roy Turek in the economics field. These are people that are, let's say, a few steps beyond you, but they are very happy and willing to provide guidance and to act as a sounding board. So don't think you can do it on your own or should do it on your own. Also because there will be a lot of failures and a lot of missteps, which you either learn from, but you learn better if you reflect with others upon that, or prevent these mistakes by learning from others, from their failures, and also build teams, because do at least, well, that's my preference perhaps, but science in itself is becoming more a team science, and you also maintain your energy much better if you work together with other people. And also, I think, perhaps last but not least, get inspired by practice, because if you understand that your work can also have an effect and influence on the real world, at least for me, that is much more rewarding than just publishing an article in a highly ranked journal. That is nice, but of course, the moment you have published this, yeah, is that the fulfillment of your life? No, probably not. It's just a way to get to other things.
No, thank you. I have a friend who says that the truth is a team sport, and I think that is a appropriate way to think about it. So thanks.
Ashwini, you go next.
Good evening, Professor. It's an absolute honor for me. I have been probing the concept of sustainability in the industrial district of my state, West Bengal, where I'm looking into the export-oriented units, manufacturing units who are engaged in the export of leather goods. Our state's exports around 55% of the total Indian exports. Now, while probing this, I was interviewing the unit owner, the government department, the state department, the central and the state department. And after that, I happened to walk into a group of workers or laborers, you know. So while talking to them, I realized that post-COVID, there have been a number of doles and advances by the central and the state governments, where they are being guaranteed about the food, clothing, and shelter. So it feels that most of their anxiety towards their daily necessity needs have been taken care of. And in return, I find their eagerness to get back into the job workforce is becoming slimmer. I mean, they find that my needs are met, so why should I work more? So what is happening, there are very few people coming towards employment, and suddenly the rates of the laborers have gone up. So I went back again to the entrepreneurs and I questioned them. So they say that it's a problem. The entire ecosystem is changing. The laborers are now demanding more for less jobs, and this is being strengthened by the doles by the government agencies. So I think there has been a shift in the behavior, and that is affecting the ecosystem. So if I have to draft the policy or suggest measures to the associations as to what my findings are, how should I suggest them? These doles cannot be stopped because they have political overtones. So what happens to the ecosystem? Does it really last, or does it affect, or it weakens the entire the district, industrial district?
Yeah, that is a rather difficult issue to reflect upon from the outside, I need to say. So I'm a bit, I try to be a bit humble here because I don't know the exact situation. I don't know the root causes of the situation in which you are in. And of course, COVID has had an influence on many regions in different ways. So on the one hand, massive state support has changed the economy to some degree. On the other hand, there's also been a rapid increase of digitalization, which also leads to other opportunities. So I can't give a very specific answer to your question. What I can say is that the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach is very much a framework for analysis and action. So if I were you, I would analyze the regional entrepreneurial ecosystem and try to find out what are the peculiar weaknesses at the moment based on data insights, and also getting conversation with the feeders of the ecosystem. So service providers, bankers, universities, governments, but also users of the ecosystem, so startups and scale-ups, to find out what are really the weakest elements of the regional ecosystem that withhold entrepreneurship to flourish, and to really use this as a sort of a heuristic device to come up with a context-specific question to what deserves attention in the ecosystem to be improved the most. So I can give you much more a process answer than a content answer, I'm afraid.
What I mean to say is there is a social theory advancing, and that is directly or indirectly affecting the sustainability of the industrial districts. You know, there is a change which is evolving, and that is not a very good incentive for the future entrepreneurs, which I can clearly see in my interviews. So we're just asking, because this is a new phenomenon which I discovered because of my interviews. Will it play a major role or not? I think that perhaps time will tell.
Yeah, for sure. You can trace the change of attitude amongst workers and the degree to which this enables or constrains self-employment and the growth of startups and scale-ups. And if labor becomes less easy to mobilize, you have to look for talent outside the region, perhaps, or perhaps that might mean that more ambitious entrepreneurs will move out and move to other regions. Yeah. Exactly. Which in itself is interesting, I think, and perhaps good for the other regions and bad for your region.
Oscar, do you want to go next?
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Professor. Hello. Thank you for your time this afternoon. I'm actually working in France, and I see several initiatives in terms of entrepreneurship ecosystems. But my question is more related to, because after reading the different papers that, for today, I'm wondering if there is some literature that might explain the entrepreneurial ecosystems as a sort of strategy of companies, major players in the market that try to create ecosystems to better compete internationally, like a sort of localization strategy. There is something like that in the literature that we can see today.
Yeah, I would like to emphasize that there are different types of ecosystem literature. So I've been mainly involved in the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach that tries to understand different levels of entrepreneurship based on different regional economic conditions. That is one type of ecosystem literature. There's another type of ecosystem literature, which is the business ecosystem literature, which very much looks at how different organizations are organized around a central value offering and how this organization can be improved upon. And I think that type of literature is much more useful and relevant for the question you pose. So, for example, the work by Ron Adner is Adner and Kapoor. These are better suitable to answering your question than the approach that I have been involved in. Sometimes this overlaps, so you can think about how particular key firms are dependent on the region and how there can be sort of a mutually beneficial relation between them. But these are really different questions. So the one question is, how do you improve the regional conditions or national or city conditions for entrepreneurship? The other question is, how do firms develop an ecosystem around their central value offering in order to create most value and also capture most of the value out of that. And whether these partners will be within the region or outside of the region is an empirical question.
In fact, I complete my question because there is an author here in France. I don't know if you know him, Olivier Torres.
Yeah, well, we just said, but he's much more focused into the role of proximity. So in the different proximities for relations. Yeah.
Yeah, so he defended the territory and it's part of the ecosystem that you are studying, that territorial aspect. But as you said initially, there might be some links that we can explore between this international business literature and the entrepreneurial ecosystem. For you, there is some sense of that?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And I've also seen some efforts to combine this, but I think these are really different audiences in the real world. So if you are Alcatel, for example, in France, and you want to develop a new product and you want to organize suppliers, services, knowledge providers along that, you're not looking in the region per se for that. So you look globally, who are the best partners to create this new value offering? Well, if you are the governor of the Languedoc, then you have to think about, it's a region in the south of France, how can we improve the Languedoc region in order to have more entrepreneurship, which is a completely different question. And of course, that might involve partly overlapping issues, but horses for courses, I would say.
Thank you, Professor.
Lucy, you want to go next?
Yes, I'd like to go next. My question is, I'd like to go next. My question is more about informalities in ecosystems in the context where the ecosystem exists. I'm from Kenya and most of the SMEs are in the informal sector, but they actually prosper so much that they employ almost 80% of the population. So the thing is, how does someone intervene as a university to improve on this ecosystem that already exists? Is there some literature that you can direct me to? I also have to admit I'm new in entrepreneurship, but I'm working on this project, so I'd like to develop some knowledge on that. So I realize the informal sector has its own way of operation. They have the lending system, they have the way in which they come up with new ideas, and patents, copyrights do not actually exist because of institutional void. So there's a lot of imitation among themselves. I realize they're also clustered in specific areas. So is there specific literature that I can read on this and some of the policy intervention that can be done in such areas? Thank you.
Yeah, so there is quite some literature, especially in development economics domain, on how informal entrepreneurs can be triggered or stimulated or supported to make the move towards formality. So that is very much about lowering the barriers to entry, improving bankruptcy regulation, improving the quality of governance in a country. There's quite a lot of work by the World Bank on this. That's one line of research. Another line of research I think especially interesting for Kenya and countries like that is how these countries leapfrog and move into digital entrepreneurship immediately. So there's work by Nicolas Federici, used to be at Oxford, and he's now somewhere in Berlin, who has done quite a lot of research on digital entrepreneurship in sub-Saharan Africa, in Kenya, Rwanda, Ghana, South Africa, understanding and how digital entrepreneurship can be the new transition in countries like that.
If I may ask, can I get in touch so you can give me the specific?
Yeah, please send me an email. You can find it somewhere on the net, and I'll respond with some references.
Okay, thank you so much.
Aftab, you're next.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for this interactive lesson. My question is, sir, mostly universities have been considered as a very important component of entrepreneurial ecosystem. But in my research, I am working on developing universities in itself as a entrepreneurial ecosystem where students can have entrepreneurial skills and develop startups and entrepreneurships. So the main problem in that I face and that I'm not able to concentrate is the level of study of different entrepreneurs of entrepreneurial ecosystem are different, and what type of outcomes should I focus on achieving while developing universities as an entrepreneurial ecosystem.
Yeah. Indeed, you can look at entrepreneurial ecosystems from different levels of analysis, and you can also see them as sort of nested phenomena, so that a university is embedded into a campus, is embedded into a city, is embedded into a region, is embedded into a country, and you need to take all these different levels into account. Even though, well, I'm a university professor myself, so I have some sympathy with looking at the university as an ecosystem. I think you should really be careful of not looking at this in a too artificial way, because the key message of the entrepreneurial ecosystem approach is that entrepreneurs should be involved both in developing the ecosystem as mentors, as investors, as role models, etc., and are also a key output of the ecosystem. And focusing too much on the university and not taking entrepreneurs from the economy, from society into account would be a real mistake, so to say.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
On the other hand, I agree with you that having a university is a blessing, because a university attracts investments in knowledge, is a talent machine, might be a connector in different types of networks. Not always, but let's say the best entrepreneurial ecosystems frequently have universities because they play these productive roles.
Okay, sir. I will look into it and will try to address that. Thank you, sir.
Navneet, you want to ask the last question from the audience?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Professor Vishal. Yeah, my question is, yeah, I have been reading literature and general article which says that if the startup in a region has to be improved, or if the economy of a region has to be improved, the entrepreneurial ecosystem of that area has to be improved. So if such be the case, can we do some research whereby we identify what we need to do to improve the entrepreneurial ecosystem so that the startup thrives in that and the economy of that area improves? So it may not be fully an academic research, it might be more towards policy making research. So I just wanted to know your views on that, whether such studies have been done, or is it worth doing such studies? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Navanita. I've done quite a lot of research on that is like that. So building up a diagnostic, so getting data as much as you can about the different elements and compare this to relevant benchmarks, and then finding out what are the strengths and weaknesses of a particular ecosystem, and then getting conversation with the relevant stakeholders to get their knowledge. This is not rocket science, so you need to have local knowledge as well to enrich your own data analysis, and also to get in conversation with local stakeholders, because they are the ones that also need to change the ecosystem. In a sense that it's not an academic exercise, but it can be informed by academic methods to source data, to interpret this data, and also make comparisons to other countries or regions that are relevant to your own back garden, so to say. So this is very much what we do, and also what, for example, the World Bank does, or what the Aspen Institute, Andy, does. So there are quite some methods to help you in that as well. And I think that is really also something that we as scientists should improve and provide better tools and metrics to have better diagnosis, and also evaluation and monitoring after things have been implemented.
Perfect. Thank you, Erik. Now I get to ask the last question, which is, what is one advice you would offer to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Yeah, so if this is something you want to spend your time on, I would say do research that you find interesting, because you will also face a lot of drawbacks, failures, disappointments, and that is relevant for an academic and practitioner audience. So an academic audience, because then you can stand on the shoulders of giants before you, but also on a practitioner audience, because that also gives you inspiration of what you can ask a zillion of questions, but some questions are just more relevant for the world outside than others. So you can get inspired for asking the right questions, but also to have your research impacting the real world, which of course for social scientists, which I think is the sort of the broader category of entrepreneurship research, should contribute to. So do research that you find interesting, that you're passionate about, but that is also relevant for academic and practitioner audiences. And perhaps stick to this for at least 10 years, because if you want to be an expert, that just takes time.
Thank you, Erik. On that note, I want to express my sincere appreciation for you taking out an hour of your time to talk to our participants today. Thank you very much.
It was an honor and pleasure, and looking forward to meet you in real places, perhaps.
Bye-bye, Erik.
Bye-bye.